This is about choosing the correct test. That's another thing you'll need to do for the final is understand what is the correct statistical test to use. And there are a few ways to make sure you know how to pick the correct test, just given a set of data. Now, these aren't all of the tests you've covered exactly. I've sort of grouped them here, but it gives you a broad idea of what you need to think about. So what is the goal or assessment of the test? How is the independent variable and the dependent variable measured? So again, this goes all the way back to those basics. Now, you can make your decision almost entirely on how the independent variable and dependent variable are measured if you think about it. Just knowing how they're measured, you can narrow it down quite a lot just looking at how we have it displayed here. Now, you'll need to know more detail in order to determine something like whether it's a single sample t-test versus an independent samples t-test, for example. But here, this is just displaying that you can at least eliminate half of the statistical tests that you have learned just by knowing how the independent variable and dependent variable are measured. So you can narrow it down to know it's either a t-test or an ANOVA, just if you know, oh, my independent variable is categorical, it has levels, and my dependent variable is continuous, like height, weight, number of depression symptoms, something like that. Now, ideally, though, you want to start at this level. You just want to understand what is the question asking. What is the goal? So to do this in a stepwise fashion, start with the research question and ask yourself, with this word problem, with these data, what is being asked? What is the goal? So if you're comparing means, for example, well, you know it can't be a regression or a chi-square. Knowing what the research question is attempting to answer is really the first major step in choosing the right statistical test. So we're going to go through these one by one. So we're going to start with the goal and understand, are we comparing means and what that might mean for us. So we'll look at these individually. So when I say comparing means, I put means in quotation marks because with ANOVAs, you really are not comparing means. You are technically comparing variance. And you've already figured that out by looking at any of those formulas for the ANOVAs. But still, you get the idea. If the goal of the research question is to compare scores between groups, you're pretty much comparing means. So understanding the goal of the test, if you're comparing groups on some mean, then you've either got a t-test or ANOVA. Now you'll need to dive deeper to figure out which t-test or which ANOVA, but you have already gotten on the right path by understanding the goal of what the research question is. The other broad goal could be to look at association between variables. This could be one of two things. It could be a chi-square test, or it could be a correlation. Those take two variables, and for chi-square, if it's a test of independence, you're looking at two categorical variables. If it's a correlation, you're looking at two continuous variables. Again, something categorical could be class, freshman, junior, sophomore, senior, that's not in order, and compare that categorical variable to another one like political party, independent, Democrat, Republican. For correlations, two variables, both continuous, so it could be height and weight. So again, then if you're doing prediction, if you see that word predict, remember in the previous slideshow, the overall final review, we said get used to associating the word predict with regressions. If you are attempting to use one variable to predict another, you've got a linear regression. So now you need more detail in order to hone in on the specific type of test that you're looking for. So that is what we're going to do here. So going back to the research goal, if the research question looks like it's trying to compare groups on means, you need to ask yourself, what is my IV? Is it categorical? And it pretty much has to be. So if we're comparing means, we're comparing groups. So that means we have a control group, a test group, medication A group, medication B group, whatever it is. our independent variable is pretty much going to be the group. Now, there might be multiple levels within that group, but it's categorical. And you can only get a measure of a distribution, like means or variance, from a continuous variable. So if your goal is to compare groups on means, so your independent variable is categorical and your dependent variable is continuous, you're looking at either some sort of t-test or ANOVA. And so let's break that down. So how many IVs do you have? How many independent variables? So with all the t-tests and ANOVAs that you've learned, there's only one thing that's capable of handling multiple independent variables. So if you have multiple independent variables, right away you know you got a factorial ANOVA. Everything else, where you see only one independent variable, it could be a t-test or a one-way or some other type of ANOVA. So first, that might be your first eliminating step is I'm comparing means. Now, how many independent variables do I have? If I've got two or more, it's got to be factorial. So let's break it down more. Going into that group that has one independent variable, that could be any of these tests right here. It could be some sort of, it could either be a single sample or dependent / paired samples t-test. It could be an ANOVA or it could be a single independent samples t-test. There are possibilities we have, so we need to know then, if we have one independent variable, how many groups or how many levels within that independent variable do I have? If I've got three or more, it's some type of ANOVA, and I'm leaving that vague, and we'll go on that in a minute. But if I have two groups within my independent variable, then it's got to be an independent samples t-test. Group A, Group B, the placebo group, the control group versus experimental group, treatment group, something like that. But then, what if I have one group? Then that leads me down another path here. Let's follow that path. So if I have one independent variable and one group, my next question needs to be how many measurements, how many time points. If I have one measurement, that means I have one independent variable, one group, one single measurement. That's got to be a single samples t-test. Backing out, if I have one independent variable, one group, but that one group gave me two measurements or two time points, then I'm looking at a paired samples or a dependent samples t-test. Alright, so let's back out and let's say that we had that one independent variable with three or more groups. It's some type of ANOVA. Now the reason why I left that vague at first was because up to this point we've mainly focused on one-way ANOVAs and factorial ANOVAs. And at the end of one of the videos covering ANOVAs in the lecture, you saw some mention of repeated measures. Now, repeated measures, ANOVA did not show up on that exam, but it's a possibility in this decision tree, so I'm presenting it to you there. So we said if we had one independent variable and three or more groups, it's an ANOVA. But we didn't go into depth with repeated measures ANOVA, but it's a possibility. So just like we did with those t-tests just on the slide before, you need to ask how many measurements or how many time points. If there are two or more time points or two or more measurement points mentioned, it's a repeated measures ANOVA. That just means what it says, repeated measures. So it's like a paired samples t-test in that you have at least two measurements. So it could be pre, post, before, and after. So it's just like a paired samples t-test in that manner. The big difference is that you have three or more groups this time. So if you have one independent variable and three or more groups, and there are multiple time points or multiple measurements, it's going to be repeated measures ANOVA. If you have three or more groups, if you have one independent variable, three or more groups, and there are not multiple measurements, multiple time points, then it's that basic, simple, one-way ANOVA. So those are probably going to be the most complex for you to narrow down. Everything else gets a little clearer because you don't have to dig quite as deep. So if the goal of the research question is to look at associations between variables, the independent variable and dependent variable are going to be the same type of measurement. So if your independent variable and dependent variable are both categorical, it's going to be a chi-square test. If they are both continuous, then it's going to be a correlation. Now again, it's first and foremost, it's important that you understand what the goal is. If it's measuring associations, then if x and y, where variable 1 and variable 2 are both continuous, it's correlations. Now, so you can break it down simply just by knowing what type of data you have. This is why it's so important to be familiar with those scales of measurement. Finally, this is really the easiest, because if you know the goal of the research question is to predict, make some sort of predicting equation, it's a linear regression. That's the only thing we've presented to you so far that will do any sort of prediction in this manner. It's a linear regression if you see something about prediction. So far the examples that you've seen have all pretty much involved one independent variable and one and a dependent variable, both being continuous. But the truth is, that's not going to matter too much. As long as you understand the goal of the research question is prediction, you can go ahead and narrow it down to it being a linear regression. The key word is predict. So again, this is just a very basic overview of how to narrow down some things, how to ask yourself some questions in order to choose the appropriate statistical test. The book also has a chart, I think it's near the back, where you can look and see a similar decision tree. So hopefully that'll help you, but it is important for you to know what kind of test you need to use given a set of data. But those are questions you have to ask yourself. What is the goal? What's the research question? Once you have that, then you need to get straight how are the data being measured? And might be a few more questions you need to know, but otherwise those first two steps will get you on the right path.